In the summer of 1921, the mountains of southern West Virginia became a literal war zone. Not just a strike or a protest, but actual war. The coal miners took up their rifles and tied red bandanas around their neck and prepared to fight, and even to die if need be. Waiting for these miners on Blair Mountain were heavily armed deputies, private detectives, and eventually the United States Army. And it would become the largest labor uprising on American soil in history, aside from the Civil War itself. To understand how America got to this point, we need to understand how the coal fields were in the early 1900s. Coal fueled America. It fueled the industrial growth, it heated homes, it fueled things like steel mills and locomotives that helped move everything all across the country. And the nation was just booming at this time, but the miners digging the coal lived in conditions that just bordered on feudalism. During this time, entire towns were controlled and owned by the coal companies. People's houses, the schools, the stores, even the churches were all ran by those in power of the coal. As many people know, miners were paid in what is called scrip, and this replaced cash. So this was a company-issued currency that each individual mine would create, and it could only be used at their stores. So the miners would use this scrip to pay for everything. Anything that you would pay as far as utilities today, or your internet, your mortgage or rent, everything was paid using company scrip. And a lot of times because of that, the company itself could inflate prices as it saw fit. Furthermore, safety regulations at this time were basically non-existent. Things like cave-ins, gas explosions, black lung disease, all of this was taking place, and miners were dying basically, daily on a very regular basis. A miner could die underground and the company would just have them replaced before the end of the shift, really. Keep in mind that America at this time was very, very tense and unstable. World War I had just ended, so veterans were returning home in droves expecting prosperity and a great bit of growth. But what they found was just a lot of inflation and unemployment, really poor labor conditions, and just growing inequality, and all across the country, labor unrest just exploded. The nation had already seen the Red Scare, anarchist bombings, violent strike crackdowns, and there was this growing fear of a communist revolution. To the wealthy industrialists, unions were seen as literal enemy armies. And in the coal fields of West Virginia, coal operators would use private detectives, sheriffs, judges, and even politicians to crush organizations from even forming. One of the most feared groups was the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. These men were essentially hired guns brought in by the coal companies. Armed detectives were brought in to intimidate workers and break strikes. They would evict families from the company homes, and they would terrorize any union supporter. These men had already built a violent reputation in earlier conflicts, such as their connections with the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado. In southern West Virginia, miners increasingly viewed them as an occupying force. Then came the town of Matewan. In 1920, organizers of the United Mine Workers of America began gaining traction in Mingo County. Thousands of miners joined the union, and coal companies immediately retaliated. Union members were fired, blacklisted, meaning it didn't matter where they tried to go, what other mine. They would find it really hard to find work, and they would be thrown out of their company housing. Baldwin Felts agents arrived in Matewan, and they started conducting evictions at gunpoint. They would literally drag families out of their company-owned homes. Women and children would just be left in the street with nowhere to go, and nobody really seemed to care. Remember, they were always paid in scrip, so it's not like they had money to where they could just go somewhere else and start a new life. But Matewan was a little bit different than some of the other towns. The chief of police, Sid Hatfield, he openly empathized with the miners, and Hatfield became this folk hero literally like overnight. He was this young lawman with gold-capped teeth, and he refused to bow to the coal operators. On May 19, 1920, Hatfield confronted the Baldwin Felts detectives near the train where they were attempting another round of evictions. Things got hot and tensions exploded. Nobody really knows who fired the first shots, but within seconds, the streets just erupted into gunfire. When the gunfire settled and the smoke cleared, 7 Baldwin Felts agents and the town mayor, Mayor Cable Testerman, lay dead in the streets, along with several others, and the shootout became known as the Matewan Massacre. As word spread to miners across Appalachia, Matewan felt like the first real victory over the coal companies. Sid Hatfield became this larger-than-life legend. There were songs written about him, miners idolized him, but the coal companies definitely wanted their revenge. Over the next year, violence escalated throughout the region. Martial law was declared, state police just started raiding the mining camps, and miners were arrested by the hundreds. Armed skirmishes broke out in valleys and hollows that were all over southern West Virginia. Some places, there were even machine gun nests that started to appear, and they would be overlooking the mining towns. And both sides at the time started stockpiling weapons and ammunition, just ready for whatever battle would come next. It was no longer just a labor dispute, it was becoming a full-on insurgency. Then came the spark that really lit the fuse. On August 1st of 1921, Sid Hatfield traveled to Welch, West Virginia, and he was there to face charges for earlier conflicts. As Hatfield and his friend Ed Chambers walked up the courthouse steps with their wives right beside them, Baldwin Felts agents ambushed them in broad daylight. Hatfield was shot dead immediately, and Chambers died moments later, reportedly being shot while lying on the ground wounded. This was again in front of many witnesses, including each of their wives, and news just spread through the fields of West Virginia like wildfire. To the miners, this wasn't just a murder, this was a full-on execution. This caused the miners to absolutely snap. They just lost their crap, and thousands of armed miners began setting themselves up and gathering along the Little Coal River and all throughout the Kanawha Valley. Many of these guys, you got to remember, these were veterans who fought in the trenches in Europe, so they knew a thing or two about what they were doing. They knew how to fight and what to expect. A lot of them wore red bandanas around their necks to kind of signify who they were, what side they were on. And I couldn't find anything definite. There are many tales I've been told of where the term redneck comes from. You know, it's from getting sunburnt on your neck when you're working in the fields. It's from this, from that. But some say this might have helped be part of the lore of where the term redneck comes from. So these miners, if you're like me, when I was first hearing of this story, I was picturing, man, there's probably dozens or maybe even 100 to a couple hundred, you know, out in the mountains of southern West Virginia. It actually swelled closer to somewhere around 10,000. And their goal was to march into Logan County, break the anti-union stronghold there, and organize miners who were trapped under the company control. The only problem with marching into Logan County, though, is that standing in their way was the Logan County Sheriff, Don Chafin. And Chafin was this fierce anti-union figure who was backed very heavily by coal money. Who would have thought that any officer of the law or politician or anything could be bought? To prepare for this, Chafin assembled roughly 3,000 deputies and state police and even just volunteers. They would all set up their own trenches and machine gun emplacements and sniper nests. And the coal operators reportedly supplied ammunition, rifles, and even private aircraft, anything they would need to stop these miners from moving in. By late August of 1921, the fighting began. Gunfire echoed throughout the mountains just for days and days. Miners would advance through the dense forest under machine gun fire, while defenders held the ridgelines above them. Once again, remember that these weren't just your blue-collar workers who, being a former blue-collar worker myself, we like to brag, you know, dirty hands, clean money, we work tough. But these guys were miners who had also fought in trenches in Europe. They knew what they were doing. The private planes that were hired by the coal operators reportedly dropped bombs and gas canisters onto the miners below. And I even read one story of a couple of women who were just doing laundry by a creek and a bomb landed in between them. Kind of like a pipe bomb, if you will. but thankfully it didn't go off. Bullets tore through trees and gun smoke drifted across the mountains. And for several days, this part of Appalachia looked more like a battlefield overseas than it did America. Casualty estimates vary pretty greatly on this because the chaos and the way that records weren't even kept make it very difficult. Some historians say that dozens were killed. Some say more of probably in excess of 100. One report that I saw said there were 3. So it's no real definite number of how many lives were lost in this skirmish, but many bodies allegedly were just buried where they fell, and thousands more were wounded or arrested. While researching, I found there was a lot of back and forth trying to get the United States military involved, and there was a lot of who called on President Harding to send troops to the region and what was done when it was done. But what we do know is that eventually Harding did step up and authorize federal troops. So they sent Army aircraft, more of just like surveillance. They weren't just like, let's fly these World War I bombers over our own country, but for surveillance, and they just wanted overall military intervention to kind of squash things. This changed a lot of things for the miners. Many of them had fought for the Army, like I said, just a few years earlier. They had worn the uniform with pride. They did what they felt was right, and they had stood up for their country. And they weren't willing to fight against it. They were willing to go against the coal operators and those who were oppressing them, but they had no beef with the United States. As the federal soldiers arrived, many of the miners started surrendering. It wasn't a sign of giving up. It wasn't a statement of, we lost. It was just a sign of respect and them saying, we're not going to fight against the country that we just fought for and fought with our brothers who we stood side by side with in battle. And they started laying down their rifles and surrendering, and by early September, the whole thing was over. The aftermath of this was absolutely devastating to the Union movement for a little while. Thousands of miners had been arrested with charges ranging from murder to treason, and Union membership in southern West Virginia just kind of tanked. Coal operators then regained control of the region for many years, and the way that this was all portrayed in the national media, shockingly, was that this was an armed insurrection rather than a workers' rebellion that came about just out of pure desperation. But Blair Mountain changed America nonetheless. The battle did expose the nation to the brutal conditions of the coal industry. Photographs of miners laying down their rifles and surrendering to the U.S. troops became iconic images of labor history. The memory of Blair Mountain lingered through the Great Depression, and it did help build public sympathy for labor reform. When New Deal legislation strengthened unions in the 1930s, coal miners finally got some of the protections they were fighting for about a decade before that. Today, Blair Mountain remains one of the most important and honestly most forgotten conflicts in all of American history. Not because of some skirmish overseas or an invasion by a foreign enemy, but because normal United States workers took up arms and fought against private organizations and armies and local governments that they saw as corrupt. For a brief moment in history, the mountains of West Virginia witnessed open warfare between labor and industry. And for a moment in 1921, the United States came closer to internal class war than most Americans have ever realized. And that's the part that was omitted.